When the majority of people encounter the phrase Spanish Inquisition, their minds immediately conjure vivid images of subterranean dark dungeons, the harrowing screams of victims bound to archaic medieval torture devices, and somber, hooded monks overseeing massive public burnings. They imagine an entire nation held in the suffocating grip of religious fanaticism for several centuries. To be fair, some of those elements did occur. However, the narrative you believe you know, the one that has been transmitted through generations of history textbooks, dramatized in Hollywood blockbusters, and even parodied in Monty Python sketches, is constructed upon a foundation that is significantly more intricate, far more political, and much more economically driven than the version you were likely told. What historians frequently misinterpret, or at the very least what becomes obscured in the constant retelling, is the fact that the Spanish Inquisition was never truly about religious faith in isolation. It was fundamentally about the acquisition and maintenance of power. It was about financial gain. It was about a fledgling, newly unified kingdom attempting to preserve its integrity by systematically manufacturing an internal adversary. Furthermore, the primary weapon utilized to achieve this was not the rack or the burning stake. It was meticulous paperwork. Therefore, allow me to transport you back, not to the year 1478 when the Inquisition was formally inaugurated, but much further into the past, to an era when Spain stood as one of the most religiously diverse regions in all of Europe. To truly grasp how the Inquisition began, one must first understand the society that existed before it was dismantled. For approximately 7 centuries, spanning from the early 700s until the late 1400s, the Iberian Peninsula served as the setting for one of the most extraordinary social experiments in the history of the medieval world. Muslims, Christians, and Jews resided side by side within a complex patchwork of various kingdoms. Historians utilize a specific term for this era, la convivencia, which roughly translates to living together or coexistence. It is important to be precise here. The convivencia was not a flawless paradise of total harmony. To suggest otherwise would be to indulge in a romanticized fairy tale. There were undeniable tensions, occasional flare-ups of brutal violence, and the power dynamics between these three distinct groups shifted perpetually depending on which faction held political authority. Nevertheless, the crucial point is that for hundreds of years, the peninsula functioned as a space where these three religious communities did not merely tolerate one another's presence. They actively collaborated. Jewish scholars were instrumental in translating Arabic texts into Latin, a process that helped safeguard Greek philosophy for the benefit of Western Europe. Muslim architects designed and constructed magnificent structures that Christian monarchs would later claim as their own heritage. Jewish physicians provided their expertise in the royal courts of Christian kings, while Muslim farmers worked the lands owned by Christian lords. The arrangement was messy and imperfect, yet it functioned effectively for a significant period. Under the period of Umayyad rule in the territory then known as Al-Andalus, the Jewish community, in particular, witnessed a profound improvement in their overall social standing. They transitioned from being a marginalized and legally constrained community under the previous Visigothic rule to becoming esteemed physicians, influential diplomats, efficient tax collectors, and trusted advisors to the caliphs. During Muslim rule, Córdoba evolved into a preeminent center of learning and high culture that rivaled any city in the Christian world. The city boasted paved streets, sophisticated public baths, and vast libraries containing hundreds of thousands of volumes. It possessed a level of intellectual refinement that made the remainder of Europe appear primitive by comparison. Jewish thinkers were positioned at the very center of this cultural flowering. Figures such as Maimonides and Hasdai ibn Shaprut rose to positions of extraordinary prominence, not in spite of their Jewish identity, but frequently because of the specialized knowledge and unique linguistic capabilities they contributed. However, this golden age was never intended to be permanent. The Reconquista, the protracted and grueling Christian military campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Islamic rule, had already been in progress for centuries. As Christian kingdoms like Castile and Aragon expanded their reach further south, the regional balance of power underwent a drastic shift. Muslim-held territories began to shrink, and Jewish communities that had once flourished under Muslim administration suddenly found themselves living under the rule of Christian monarchs who were, at their best, ambivalent regarding their presence. Yet even within these Christian-ruled lands, Jews continued to perform essential roles. They functioned as tax farmers, bankers, and high-level administrators. Many occupied positions of significant trust and influence that the average Christian could only hope to achieve. As one might expect, this dynamic fostered deep-seated resentment. This is the point where the narrative takes a significantly darker turn and where we begin to identify the origins of what would eventually manifest as the Inquisition. It was not the Jews themselves who initially became the primary target. Rather, it was the conversos. To understand the trajectory of the Inquisition, one must understand the meaning of the term conversos. In the year 1391, a devastating wave of anti-Jewish violence surged across the Iberian Peninsula. This violence originated in Seville, where a priest named Ferran Martinez had spent over a decade inciting hatred against the Jewish population. On June 6th, violent mobs launched an assault on the Jewish quarter of Seville. Thousands of individuals were slaughtered, their homes were pillaged and demolished, and the survivors were presented with a horrific ultimatum: convert to Christianity or face immediate death. This violence spread with the speed of a wildfire. Within a matter of weeks, it had reached Cordoba, Barcelona, Valencia, and dozens of other municipalities across the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. While historical estimates vary, some scholars believe that as many as 50,000 Jews were either murdered or subjected to forced baptism during the pogroms of 1391. In Barcelona alone, at least 400 people were killed, and the Jewish quarter was razed to the ground, with every one of its 23 synagogues destroyed. By 1394, the Jewish community of Barcelona, which had served as a vibrant center of intellectual life for 4 centuries, effectively ceased to exist. These forced conversions gave rise to a new social class known as conversos, meaning converts. These individuals had been baptized into the Christian faith, many of them literally at the point of a sword. Legally and officially, they were now Christians. However, it is vital to recognize that many of these conversions were not born of sincere belief. How could they be? You had tens of thousands of people who had lived as Jews their entire lives, practicing ancient rituals, observing sacred holidays, and raising their children within the Jewish faith. Suddenly, overnight, they were informed they were now Christians. While some genuinely embraced their new religion and became devout Catholics, even joining the priesthood or monastic orders, many others, perhaps the majority, continued to practice Judaism in the shadows. They would light Sabbath candles behind locked doors, observe dietary laws in private, and celebrate Passover in hidden chambers. Outwardly, they appeared Christian. Inwardly, they remained Jewish. The Christian establishment was well aware of this reality. What made the converso situation truly volatile, and this is a detail that most popular historical accounts overlook, is that the conversos did not remain at the bottom of the Spanish social hierarchy. On the contrary, once they were baptized, they were technically Christians, which meant that all the legal restrictions previously placed on Jews no longer applied to them. The bans on holding public office, the prohibitions against entering specific professions, and the limits on land ownership were suddenly lifted. The conversos, many of whom were highly educated, skilled, and well-connected even before their conversion, wasted no time in ascending the social ladder. Within a single generation, conversos had successfully integrated into nearly every level of the Spanish elite. They became bishops, abbots, court physicians, and royal advisors. They functioned as tax collectors, bankers, lawyers, and university professors. Some married into the most ancient noble families in Spain. Some became so prominent that it was later asserted, not entirely without evidence, that virtually every noble lineage in Spain possessed at least some converso blood. For instance, Luis de Santangel and Gabriel Sanchez, 2 conversos, were fundamental in securing the financing for Christopher Columbus's historic voyage to the Americas. Converso families held positions of immense influence within the church, the government, and the financial infrastructure. All of this occurred within roughly 2 or 3 generations following the mass conversions. Consider the perspective of an ordinary Christian farmer in 15th century Castile, watching these former Jews rise to heights of power and wealth that he could never hope to attain? Or consider a minor nobleman whose family had been Christian for centuries, suddenly seeing his daughter courted by the wealthy son of a family that was Jewish only 40 years prior. This created a sense of being cheated and a feeling of intense anger. It felt as though the system had been hijacked by outsiders. Consequently, a poisonous idea began to take root in Spanish society. The notion that these conversos were not real Christians, that they had converted only for social advantage, and that behind their baptismal certificates, they were still loyal to their old faith and conspiring against the true Christians of Spain. The old Christians, those who could prove their families had been Christian for generations, began to view the conversos with a toxic blend of jealousy, suspicion, and hatred. This leads us to the concept of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood. This is a critical concept because it represents one of the earliest instances of racialized thinking in European history. Limpieza de sangre was not concerned with what an individual believed. It was concerned with who their ancestors were. You could be the most pious Catholic in Spain, attending Mass daily and naming your children after saints. But if your grandmother was Jewish, or if there was even a single drop of Jewish or Muslim blood in your lineage, you were considered tainted, impure, and untrustworthy. The first formal statute regarding blood purity appeared in Toledo in 1449, nearly 30 years before the Inquisition was officially established. Following a violent anti-converso riot, the city passed a decree barring conversos from municipal office regardless of their religious conduct. The logic was breathtakingly cruel. Your blood mattered more than your faith. This was a racial standard, not a religious one. Despite initial condemnation from the king and the pope, the idea had massive popular support and spread to other cities and prestigious institutions, creating a bureaucratic industry of genealogical investigation, forgery, and denunciation. When Ferdinand and Isabella formally established the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, they were not creating a new phenomenon. They were institutionalizing a system of persecution that had been developing for decades. Their motivations were not primarily religious, despite what many historians have emphasized. While Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, were undoubtedly pious, Isabella especially, they were also incredibly shrewd political actors. Their marriage in 1469 united Castile and Aragon, but the union was fragile, consisting of territories with different laws, languages, and customs. The Inquisition provided them with a unique tool for centralizing power. Unlike other legal institutions, the Inquisition answered directly to the crown, bypassing local bishops, the pope, and the regional nobility. The monarchs appointed the inquisitors and controlled the finances. In a fragmented kingdom, the Inquisition was the one institution that could override local authorities and impose the royal will across all borders. Furthermore, there was the financial aspect. When the Inquisition convicted someone of heresy, their entire property, homes, businesses, and savings, was confiscated by the institution, with a significant portion flowing into the royal treasury. The primary targets were wealthy conversos, merchants, bankers, and professionals. Convicting them of secret Judaism not only served a religious purpose, but also filled the coffers of a crown that was constantly short on cash, particularly due to the expensive war against the Muslim kingdom of Granada. Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor, even directed that confiscated assets be used to fund the war effort. At its core, the early Inquisition was a massive transfer of wealth, justified by the language of faith. Torquemada himself is a fascinating and misunderstood figure. Born in 1420, he was a Dominican friar, known for extreme personal austerity. Yet he was also of converso origin himself. His uncle was a prominent cardinal with Jewish ancestry. As Isabella's personal confessor, he wielded immense influence, convincing her to marry Ferdinand and turning the Inquisition into a nationwide instrument of terror. He established a network of 24 holy offices and codified the methods of interrogation. This brings us to the myth of the torture chambers. While the Inquisition did authorize brutal methods like the strapado, water torture, and the rack, they did not invent these techniques. Every secular court in Europe used them, often with less restraint. The Inquisition actually had formal rules. Torture could only be applied once, could not last more than 15 minutes, required a physician's presence, and could not permanently maim the accused. In an era of unregulated witch trials in other parts of Europe, the Spanish Inquisition was, paradoxically, one of the more regulated judicial bodies of its time. Historian Henry Kamen argues that much of our perception of the Inquisition is the result of the Black Legend, a campaign of anti-Spanish propaganda started in the 16th century by Spain's political and religious rivals, such as the Dutch and the English. They depicted inquisitors as sadistic monsters to symbolize Spanish barbarism, even though these rival nations were often guilty of equal or greater cruelties in their own territories and colonies. The auto da fe, or act of faith, was a public spectacle where the accused were paraded in San Benitos, penitential garments. Those who confessed faced humiliation and property loss, while those judged as relapsed heretics were handed over to secular authorities to be burned at the stake. However, modern research suggests the scale of executions was much lower than popular myths suggest. Over its 350-year history, approximately 3,000 to 5,000 people were executed out of about 150,000 accused. While any execution for belief is an outrage, the Inquisition functioned more through fear, surveillance, and social control than through mass killing. The true terror was the knock on the door and the potential for a neighbor's denunciation to destroy a family's reputation for generations. This climate led to the Alhambra Decree of 1492, which expelled all Jews from Spain who refused to convert. They were given 4 months to leave and forced to sell their property at a fraction of its value. Between 100,000 and 200,000 Sephardic Jews were scattered across the Mediterranean and beyond. Those who stayed and converted only increased the number of conversos for the Inquisition to investigate, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of suspicion. The logic of the Inquisition was eventually applied to Spain's Muslim population as well. In 1502, Muslims in Castile were forced to convert or leave. Those who converted, known as Moriscos, faced the same suspicions as the conversos. The Inquisition investigated whether they were secretly practicing Islam, leading to further prosecution and humiliation. This culminated in 1609 when King Philip III ordered the total expulsion of all Moriscos. Approximately 300,000 people were driven out, causing agricultural collapse and economic catastrophe in regions like Valencia and Aragon. As the Reformation spread, the Inquisition also targeted Protestantism, effectively eliminating it from Spain by the mid-16th century. Interestingly, the Inquisition's insistence on evidence actually made it more skeptical of witchcraft than other European nations. During a witch-hunting craze in the early 1600s, the Inquisition concluded most accusations were baseless, effectively ending witch burnings in Spain while they continued to rage in Protestant Germany and England. Ultimately, the Spanish Inquisition was a political institution dressed in religious garb. It served the crown by imposing uniformity, breaking the power of the nobility, and redistributing wealth. It lasted for 356 years, finally being abolished in 1834. In its later years, it functioned as a moral police force and censorship board, becoming the surveillance arm of the Spanish state. The real lesson of the Inquisition is the danger of unchecked state power and the use of ideology to justify the destruction of families and reputations. Its methods, anonymous denunciation, secret interrogation, and the presumption of guilt, are the same techniques used by modern authoritarian regimes. The Inquisition was not the result of a unique Spanish pathology, but a tool of statecraft used to consolidate power by creating an enemy to fear. The conversos were targeted not just for their faith, but because their success threatened the status quo. This story of defining a group as suspect to maintain power is one that has repeated throughout history. Spain only recently began to address this legacy, offering citizenship to Sephardic descendants in 2015. The ghosts of the Inquisition remind us that the game of finding someone to blame and calling it justice is still being played today, and we must never stop questioning it. If this story has changed the way you perceive the historical forces that shaped our world, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. We are dedicated to unearthing the history that many have tried to keep buried. Join us as we continue to explore the past to better understand our future. The next chapter of our journey will be revealed very soon.